Good afternoon, everyone that is here. Sorry for the confusion on the start time. I was ready at 1. Just put for the record. I was ready to go. I'm Karen Mogus. I'm Deputy Director, Division of Water Quality here at the State Water Board. I am the executive sponsor on the Toxicity Provisions Project. This is our 5th public staff workshop that we've had since the release of the 2018 version of the provisions, and we are going to focus on a couple of appendices that are being added to the staff report and therefore to the record, and so it's out for public comment, and we'll get more into that in a minute. I do want to recognize my staff who are in the room today, primarily because if you ask really probing questions, they're probably going to answer them. I probably won't. So just go ahead and, since you're all by a mic, why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
So this is Zane Polson.
Rich Brewer.
Hi, everybody. Rebecca Fitzgerald.
Elizabeth Barrett, Office of Chief Counsel.
John Wheeler.
Katie Fong.
Thank you. Thank you. And since it's such a small group in the room, I don't know, should we do introductions, move the mic around? Let's do that really quickly.
Tom Grovog, Larry Walker Associates.
Josh Westfall, LA County Sanitation Districts.
Steve Jepson with SCAP.
Josie Teller, City of Davis.
Charles LaSalle, Water Reuse, California.
Cameron Irvine, RBI.
Rebecca Franklin, Sacramento Regional County Sanitation District.
Peter Arth, Enthalpy Analytical.
Debbie Webster, Central Valley Clean Water Association.
Stephen Clark, Pacific Eco Risk.
Edward Ortiz, Media Office.
Hi, Jared Voskel with CASA.
Caitlin Kalua with California Coastkeeper Alliance.
Drew Ganner, McCampbell Analytical.
Paul Bedore, RBI.
All right, so Zane wanted to get some extra steps in today, so thanks, Zane, for moving the microphone around. That actually demonstrates, so if anyone wants to either make a comment or ask a question, you're going to need a microphone in hand before you are allowed to speak, because we are being webcast, and the people on the webcast will not be able to hear you unless you have a microphone. So thank you for migrating to the front of the room, make it a little easier to get the microphone to where it needs to be. And we'll just go ahead and get started. So before I launch into the meat of the presentation, I want to give you all a little background on how we got to where we are today. We released the draft provisions post the long hiatus between 2012 and 2018. In October of 2018, had a public comment period that ended on December 21st, wait, is it 18? Yeah, it's 2020. Whoa, I'm losing track of time. So December 21st, 2018, and in the interim period between, during the comment period, we had a hearing before the board, and subsequent to the comment period, reviewed comments and had many focused stakeholder meetings with many of you all here in the room and others to go over comments, make sure we understood the comments so that we could make meaningful edits as necessary. We then released a revised draft staff report and provisions in July of 2019, and subsequent to that also held a workshop in October before the board to go over the changes that we made and again hear more comments from stakeholders. That was a workshop, it was not for action. Since then, we have continued to work through comments both received during the comment period, as well as what we heard at the workshop in October, and the direction that we received from the board members at that time. So we're still working through those things. We are continuing to have focused stakeholder meetings. In fact, in December, held a couple of focused stakeholder meetings with folks who requested it or had particular information that we wanted to follow up from the workshop on. Also in this interim period, since the release of the 2018 version of the provisions, there have been a couple of developments in terms of the technical basis for use of the test of significant toxicity. There was a published paper from Fox et al., as well as some additional data analysis that my staff conducted in coordination with our permitting staff, as well as some of the regulated community, looking at data that has been produced since the test drive. So for those of you who have been involved in this for a long time will remember that there was a test drive document that was released back in 2011-12 that looked at what the impacts of using the statistical approach called the test of significant toxicity would have on both basically, would we see more fails, more toxicity, less toxicity as compared to the other statistical approaches that were in use? Staff looked at the publication as well as our own data analysis with data from the last few years that is coming from facilities who are actually required to use the TST in their permits. And we also solicited a memo to go over the probabilities of violations and requirements for follow-up called a toxicity reduction evaluation, and what those probabilities are based on the 5% false positive rate that we've set as part of the TST. And then we have a second appendix. So that's the first appendix. It's kind of going over those analyses and those documents, and as a additional technical basis for the TST. And then the second appendix is just documenting the survey that we did of laboratories back last spring to ask them a few questions about the feasibility of conducting the necessary tests for assessing compliance with the monthly median effluent limitation. So since we were already adding an appendix, we decided to go ahead and document that survey that we did so that it's all part of the record as well. So those are the two appendices, and we'll go into more detail as I get into the presentation, but wanted to give you guys the rundown of the goings-on that have occurred in the last, now it's a little over a year since the draft, the 2018 version. So with that, unless I have any questions about process, I will go ahead and move on and launch into the presentation. So I think I've already covered this first slide, is really to just provide an overview of the two appendices. Most of the content is going to be about Appendix J, which is looking at test performance, and in particular for the Cereodaphnia test, reproduction test, and how that impacts the rates of, we'll get into it. I want to make sure I say it correctly. And then Appendix K is the survey of laboratory toxicity test capacities. And then we'll answer any questions and hear comments. What I failed to mention is that both of these appendices were released for public comment on Christmas Eve. So last year, love to say that. Anyway, on Christmas Eve, and the comment period will extend to February 10th. So comments are due at noon on February 10th. So we didn't want to be accused of making you guys look at our appendices over Christmas, although if you did, I'm sure it got you some good sleep time as a result. And then and I'll go over the schedule for the remainder of the project at the end of the presentation.
Can I just jump in for a minute and say that there's a few copies of this presentation on the back table. I don't know if they're all out now or not, but the presentation's also available online for anybody who's watching on the web. If they go to our program webpage off of the Water Board's page, they can get to the presentation as well.
Also, just for people online, on each slide there's the email address for people to email in your questions and comments. And I have staff monitoring that, and they will be able to read your questions or comments during.
Yeah, that reminds me, I forgot all of the logistics things I'm supposed to tell you. There are restrooms to the south, down the hallway, if you need those. And then if there's an alarm, we will all gather our stuff together and in a calm fashion exit the building. And if you are inclined, you can join us at our convening spot in Cesar Chavez Park, or you can go get coffee somewhere. But that's the procedure if we hear an alarm. All right. So, Appendix J. We're going to start with J. The purpose is to discuss recent research and information on how lab performance affects the pass or fail result of the chronic C. dubia reproduction toxicity test using the TST versus the no observable effect concentration statistical approaches. The document, the appendix actually has 5 sections. It starts with key findings, and in fact, my presentation today is structured around the key findings. A summary of key statistical concepts, and I've picked a few that I want to make sure are clear in the presentation. I'm not going to go over every single one that's in the appendix, but wanted to pick out a few that are, we want to make sure we're all on the same page as to what we're talking about. And then the last few bullets, analysis of lab performance and its effects on acceptable false positive probabilities, assessment of actual permit compliance data, and the probabilities of violations or being required to conduct a TRE. All of those will be part of the key findings when I get there. So starting with our key statistical concepts, there are 3 that I just wanted to make sure we were all clear on. If you have a copy of the appendix and want us to clarify any others, happy to do that, but I think these are the key ones. So first off is the percent effect, or the mean percent effect, and it is the difference between the control mean and the sample mean divided by the control mean. So that's what the percent effect is, and it does not take into account variability. It's just an average of the neonates produced by the mother serial, the gravid females. I don't know. What do we want to call them? Gravid females? Okay. Steve has authorized me to call them gravid females during the test. And so it's important to know that because the percent effect doesn't take into account variability, and we'll get into variability in a second, you could have the same percent effect, and in one test it's a pass, and one test it's a fail. So that's important to keep in mind. And what really determines that, to a large degree, is the coefficient of variation within the test. So that measures the relative variation of a data set. It's how widespread are the neonates produced by a set of gravid females in the test. And it's defined as the standard deviation divided by the mean, and a lower CV value indicates lower within test variability, or you'll often see, and in fact in the appendix you'll see it referred to as higher precision. Higher precision, smaller range of variability than lower precision with a higher range of variability. And then finally, the false positive this is one that we all have different ways of using and have referred to it differently, I think, over the past however long I've been involved with this. So this is what we mean when a sample is declared toxic, but the sample is in fact not toxic. So I think we all agree on that, right? No? Josh does not agree.
Thanks. Again, thank you for the statistical concepts, or the, I just call it the glossary in here. I do think it's really helpful to make sure that we know what we mean when we say different words. In the appendix, it specifically says that the only true false positive is one where the sample is known to be absolutely non-toxic and the test results in a fail at or below the 10% effect. And I'm only seeing half of that here.
Yeah, so this is a paraphrase, and in fact, I was going to say those.
Well, because I think that's an important distinction. And because, we've talked about before that, and I totally respect that the statistical false positive is exactly what we're describing here, but I just want to, reiterate that we care deeply about what we've been referring to as, false determinations of toxicity, whereas you can have a truly non-toxic sample that has a 50% effect. It's not a statistical issue at all. I just want to make sure that that's addressed in here somewhere.
It is not, that topic is not addressed in the appendix.
So I do think, that it would be clear, and perhaps it would help if we added a word and called it a statistical false positive. Maybe that would reduce confusion.
Well, you got can you guys hear me? You got a great point. We are actually in the process of making a few minor revisions to this appendix right now. And we had hoped to have it posted before this workshop, but it was probably going to be posted tomorrow. And one of the changes we're making is actually to strike the language, the 10% effect from this definition, recognizing that there can be percent effects.
There can be false positives at higher than 10% effects.
That's right.
That is true.
Thanks. One other point for clarification. This is for this slide, but for the appendix as well. It might be helpful to kind of be clear when we're talking about percent effect, if we're talking about the population percent effect versus the sample percent effect, because the Fox memo is quite clear when he refers to percent effect that he's referring to population. And I just think it would help for clarity if we could carry that throughout the appendix.
Okay, that's good input. So when we're talking about false positives in the context of this appendix, we're going to look at the false positive probability of 5%. That's where we've set the acceptable false positive probability rate. And that is set so that we should not see false positives at a percent effect of less than 10%, more than 5% of the time. Did I get that right, Rich? Okay, good. I've given all my staff a hook. And they can, Karen, you've gotten it wrong again. Okay, so that was the only statistical concepts I was going to go over. Are there others that that we needed to clarify? I thought the rest were pretty straightforward, but these ones were, these ones were ones that I wanted to make sure they're pretty critical in reading the appendix. Okay. So launching into our key findings. So finding number 1 is that within test variability is low and percent effect is also low, the NOEC, the no observable effect concentration statistical approach, is more likely to declare a sample toxic than the test of significant toxicity. And the reason that is that, can I finish what I was going to say? Maybe I'll answer your question before. Let me just go through the slide and we'll let you speak. The reason that is that the TST actually sets that boundary of 10% within the calculation, whereas the NOEC does not. So I think any practitioners in the room will be able to assert that when they have low variability in a test, and there are certain tests that tend to have very low variability among their replicates, that you can see statistical effects at very small percent effects using the NOEC, and the TST is designed to prevent that at the very low percent effects under 10%. Then I'll make the second point, and then if I haven't addressed your issue, we'll give you the mic. And then within test variability is high and percent effect is greater than or equal to 25%, the NOEC is less likely to declare a sample toxic. So you have high variability, so your range of neonates produced by your gravid females is a wide range. and a high percent effect, your NOAC is not going to see that as statistically significant, whereas TST always will. So with that,
Thank you. I promise I will not ask questions all day.
you don't have to promise that. That's what we're here for.
I will not. But very minor, but just for the sake of completeness, I think that it's worth, on the first bullet point, noting that there are some, there have been some measures taken with the methodology to try to reduce that frequency of the NOAC declaring those tests toxic. Just factoring in the PMSD type things.
Sure, but the NOAC actually does declare it toxic. The PMSD is an additional review that allows a regulated entity to say that this should not be considered a toxic sample.
Point well taken.
All right, any others before I move on? This is just fascinating stuff. All right. I try to explain this to, my mother, and she's like, what? She actually listened to the October workshop, and she had all these questions for me. What's a Cereodaphnia? So I'm sending her links to things and stuff. It's pretty cool. Okay, so I digress. Key finding number 2. The Fox et al. 2019, so that's the peer-reviewed journal publication that I referred to that has come out since the October 2018 version of the provisions, indicated that 4 out of the 6 laboratories that they examined had low within test variability and low enough that it can attain the acceptable, those laboratories could attain the acceptable false positive probability of a fail at less than 10% effect using just 10 replicates. So it was an analysis of their median coefficient of variation in the lab versus the way the TST is designed. And so they have low enough variability to achieve that 5% rate of false positive below 10% effect. And then if the number of replicates were increased to 20, then an additional one of those 6 laboratories would be able to meet the acceptable false positive probability. So when we say that the TST incentivizes improved test performance, that's kind of what we're talking about. And this just shows the laboratories that were analyzed or evaluated, and you can see that those with the higher median control CV in the 1, 2, 3, 4th column, so that would be commercial lab A and commercial lab C, are not able to meet that false positives rate with that median CV with 10 replicates. But if you increase to somewhere between 10 and 20, and it could be up to 20. I don't recall if this particular one, we had an exact number of replicates. But at any rate, increasing the replication, one more lab would be able to achieve that 5% false positives probability. All right, moving on to finding number 3. We conducted our own analysis, essentially based on the work that Fox did on data that had been collected more recently. So Fox's data was, he looked at data from 2012 to 2015. The data we were looking at was collected and reported as part of permit requirements from 2015 to 2019. And our analysis was pretty consistent with what Fox found. We found that 3 out of 4 laboratories had low within test variability and can attain the acceptable false positive rate. I can say that a million times. And then if we increase the number of replicates to up to 20, then all 4 of the labs that we were looking at could achieve the results. And this shows the information similar in the previous example. And commercial laboratory 3 had just a little bit elevated coefficient of variation, median control coefficient of variation, as you can see here. And in fact, that laboratory would only have to increase their replication in their control and their in-stream waste concentration to 11, not up to 20. Now, having been in the lab and knowing how these things are set up, that's like you might as well do 10 more reps. But just, 11 would have been fine. But anyway. All right. Key finding number 4. The TST statistical approach incentivizes labs to produce more precise data and increase statistical power. I already kind of alluded to that in a previous example, and so we have a couple of examples here from LA County and then another commercial lab. So this shows the data that we looked at LA County, and really the most compelling kind of result here is that the maximum CVs have decreased overall, with the exception of 2016 compared to results prior to the TST being required in their permit. If you look at the minimums, they're relatively the same and may have even increased actually recently. But the average medians prior to 2014 is around 13.6, and the average since then is around 12.8. So the precision has improved. I wouldn't say that it has precipitously improved, or the CV has declined precipitously according to this, but some improvement. Yeah, Josh, since this is your data, you are more than welcome to talk about it.
I did just want to point out a minor error on this figure. In our earliest permits adoption, or our permits with the TST in them, the earliest start date for those permits was January 1, 2015.
Okay, thank you. We will correct that.
And then I do just have to go on record, based off of the earlier Fox paper, and make sure I can, give kudos to the lab and say that the lab did not try to get better because of the TST. The lab always strives to be a high-performing lab.
Thank you. And I think that goes, for most laboratories, they are trying to produce good data. Yeah, Cam.
Thanks, thanks, Karen. I just think this graph really illustrates very well the fact that that CVs can vary a lot, right? Mm-hmm. We see here CVs as high as 67.8, lows of 38 lows in the 3.1 range. And this is just for one lab. And Fox et al. Shows that as well, where we had CVs as high as 47 or 49 for the labs with the lowest mean CVs and the highest mean CVs. And yet this analysis that was done in this appendix was based on a median or an average, I'm just not quite sure, but a median CV, which is, so I think it underestimates, the whole analysis underestimates the false positive frequency, because each test is really evaluated based on its own test variability, not a mean amongst all the tests. Yeah. And that's pointed out in the back of the Fox memo. It's at least suggested, but I think it's a really important point to make.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just for those that aren't practitioners of this test, we presented it, my company, myself, had a presentation at the CTAC conference back in Toronto, and we evaluated a set of data because you get this variability across many tests in terms of the CV for individual tests. And here you have your ranges. I think that's range, minimum, maximum.
Yeah.
And what's the driver for this test is the test is a 3-brood test. And so when 60% or greater, the day that 60% or greater of your females have produced their 3rd brood in the lab control, you terminate it. So the 3 factors that we identified that caused the higher variability were any mortality in the test in the control, any organism that missed all broods, or any organisms that missed the 2nd or 3rd broods in the control would cause CVs in the control to go up. And so laboratories may have a median or a mean of 11, 13, 12 year over year or whatever, but the high end of the range is typically driven by those factors that are built into the test by EPA, where you do not take the test until all organisms produce a 3rd brood in the control. 60% or more is when you terminate.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up, because that is potentially an area where we may want to be more stringent in the method as part of our study, that as a recommendation that, yeah, 60% is the minimum, but in California, we're going to go to 80 or 100, assuming they're not dead, of course. I mean, they're not going to produce any broods if they're dead. So, but I think it's North Carolina. I can't recall. Is it North Carolina that actually has increased the percent of females that have to have a brood? I can't recall. There is a state that actually did that. And I can't say that we've looked at their data to see if it's improved the CV situation, but it's certainly something that we can consider here. Yes.
Along those lines, it would be important for us to know the plans for an increase in the percentage. When do you think we would be aware of that or have an idea of the plans associated with the provisions?
Are you going to participate in our study in our stakeholder group?
Maybe.
How about, are you going to subscribe to the LIRIS list where we'll, during the study is when we'll come up with those kinds of recommendations, is my point. So that would be, and certainly things that we would want to consider and even maybe incorporate into the study to see what impact it might have. So in the next 3 years, and we will communicate it to stakeholders.
Yeah, this just goes back to the message where it really helps us get an idea at the time of adoption of what our position would be when we have a better idea of what the study content will be. So, I understand that, but you mentioned there's precedent for increasing the percentage, and I understand that you want to do the study first to determine where that might be, but indications that you'd be looking for a certain goal of precision, for lack of a better word, would really help us.
Well, the precision necessary to meet the 5% probability of a false positive less than 10% would certainly be a goal that we would be looking toward. How to achieve that is part of what we would want to be studying as part of the study. But more to come. Others before? All right. Just note that I'm, about halfway through and I haven't gotten the hook yet, so that's a performance measure. I'm good to go. Okay, so this is the second example, and it basically here it's showing over the pre-2012 test drive. This is and then the 2012 to 2015 and 2017 to 2018 data from one of LA County's municipal laboratories. CV is lower than it was in the pre-2012 test drive, and then another commercial laboratory has decreasing CVs over the last few years. So just, again, looking at how implementation of TST may incentivize improved lab performance. Does that work for you? Okay. All right, so key finding number 5 is that the TST statistical approach is less likely than the no observable effect concentration to identify a sample as toxic when biological effects are negligible or less than or equal to 10% effect, and will always identify a sample as toxic when the percent effect is greater than or equal to 25%. And we looked at 984 lab test results and found that we have seen no fails below 10% effect using the TST statistical approach, and no passes above 25% effect. So essentially the TST is doing what it's designed to do. And the next couple of slides illustrate that. This is from the data from the TST test drive. This is not all of the data in the test drive. It's just the MPDES facilities, and it just, again, shows that we have no fails below a 10% effect, and that we have no passes above 25% effect. And to be clear, we do have some fails between 10 and 25%, and those fails are considered to be toxicity. Those are not false positives. Or at least we can't tell whether or not they're false positives, because for any one test, you aren't able to define it as a false positive. That has to be done at the population level. And then this is LA County's data, and very similar results with no fails below 10%, no passes above 25%, and generally few fails between the 10 and 25%. But as you get closer to 25% effect, you get more fails. Yes, Cam.
So on the previous slide, sorry, I didn't catch it before I changed it. Just to expand on Josh's point from earlier, where the PMSD does get considered in interpreting the test data. I understand how the NOAC statistic, or the statistic used to determine the NOAC, came up with these results. But there was one case where there was a sample with 11.8% effect. That's in that box with the 8 above it. And so that would not have been determined to be toxic according to EPA 2002. So just a
using
distinction.
the NOAC.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And we're not asserting that in all cases the NOAC and TST are going to come up with the same result, although generally speaking they do. All right. Key finding number 6. This is the memo that we solicited from Fox. We wanted to get a sense of what's the likelihood of having violations of our effluent limitations as proposed in the provisions, and based on a percent of a fail at below 10% effect, and then what is the probability of of having to conduct a TRE, so in other words, having 2 violations in a single month or multiple consecutive months, causing a TRE to be required. What's the probability of that based on fails below 10%? And basically the upshot is that both of those probabilities is pretty low. So not only do we have the acceptable false positive rate set at 5% for false positives, but then we have this other rubric that we've put into the provisions that provides for any single violation is not going to, any single fail of the TST is not going to cause a violation unless you have greater than 50% lethality, less than 50% survival, causing a maximum daily effluent limitation violation. And so the MMEL requires at least 2 fails in a calendar month. And so the probability of that occurring with fails below 10% is pretty low. And this slide basically shows an example of that. This was done with multiple iterations of the CV versus the number of replicates. This is just an example using the coefficient of variation of 0.15, which is right in the arena of nationwide average or median CVs. And then the 10 replicates, of course, is the minimum number of replicates required by the method. And so the probability of a single TST fail is, of course, right, less than 10%, is right about 5%, which makes sense because that's where we've set the probability rate. The probability of an MMEL violation is less than 1%, less than 0.5% actually. And then the probability again of having to conduct a TRE in this instance is, 2,000 times lower. Yes. Okay, I hope I can answer it, but if I can't, I've got capable people.
Okay, thanks, and apologies for all these interruptions. But this is, I think, a really helpful dialogue, and I wanted to thank the State Board for sharing the data that went behind these analyses.
Oh, I should say one thing before your question. We found an error in some transcription of the probabilities in the appendix. I believe the revised, it doesn't modify the conclusions, but we saw that there was inconsistencies between, I think it's the Fox memo or the paper, the memo?
There was, am I on? Fox sent us a second revised memo in December, about December 15th, and both those are in the, on the website for you. And in that case, there was some of the calculations we needed to the table didn't get updated when it was released on 12/24, so the new one will have the updated probabilities as well.
And
so,
that'll go out in the next day or so.
yeah.
It doesn't change
It doesn't change the overall, it actually, for the labs that are have the lower of the CV values, it actually, the probability was even less for the consecutive MMELs. The one lab with the CV of about 0.23, it actually was slightly worse, but it's still extremely low compared to the 5% acceptable false positive rate.
Yeah, and again, I'm sorry, there's one more clarification I want to make. This calculation is based on the violations that are based on two MMEL fails or violations, not the MDEL. So for the TRE, you could have an MMEL and an MDEL that kicks you into a TRE. We didn't do that calculation of the probability of that. Yeah.
And then to Josh's point, and Karen pointed out earlier, we've struck that that was something where there was like a global harmonization and someone didn't realize that wasn't the false positive probability, that was the description of a false positive. So good catch, and we actually have already struck that from it'll be in the release. So
Okay, with all of those caveats, Cam, please ask your question.
So I can't help but wonder if it would have saved us an hour of time today, and part of the discussion you had with your mother about this, if the State Water Board, which considers a less than 10% effect a false positive, deemed to be acceptable or negligible are the words that are used in the various documents, why not, as a regulatory management decision point, or RMD, just determine that less than 10% effect is never a fail? Just like on the conversely, greater than 25% is always a fail.
I mean, I think that functionally that's what's occurring, right? I mean, we don't have any fails below 10% that we've seen in a huge data set. So, I mean, we did set 10% as a regulatory management decision as part of the TST. So, yes, go ahead.
So once again, remember, percent effect is just a straight calculation. It doesn't incorporate the variability of the data set. So when you say below 10%, you really don't know if it's below 10%. So that's why we have that built in, the CV and that false positive probability of 5% of the time, we want to call that, because the TST itself takes into the variability of the data set, and percent effect doesn't. So just it's not a hard line when you look at that. The second thing is the TST, when you go through the TST documents and statistics, you're really setting that the beta is set by the overall formula. So it's built on that. So to change that, we'd have to look at the whole way that the statistics are done.
In terms of the probabilities, one thing that may be valuable for some people to see noted is that these are a somewhat conservative estimate or calculation, because there's an assumption built into this iterative process that each of these samples are independent of each other. When, if I look around at the practitioners in the room, if it's something that's not real toxicity, as I'll call it, but maybe there's something weird going on with the cultures, one batch, it's far more likely that you're going to see this in multiple tests than would be reflected statistically.
Say that again.
that each of these samples for this statistical procedure here to calculate the probabilities were independent draws, meaning that you have the same likelihood of failing the TST on one of them as you do on the next. When in practice, I'm not going to say a lot of the times, and hopefully this is something that is addressed in the study, but what we kind of term laboratory effects or acclimation, or there's a problem with the cultures, in those situations, there isn't true independence, that your cultures aren't doing well, and that is more likely to result in more failures. Like I said, hopefully that's something that we look at when we do this study, is what sort of an effect that may have.
Okay, I get it now. Thanks. I think it's on.
I'm colorblind. It's green. Okay, there we go. Maybe to add a little bit more detail to what Josh was indicating is for laboratories, it's not uncommon to run multiple tests on the same day. And so therefore, if you are experiencing a food or a culture-related issue that can change the variability of the test, it's likely to affect multiple tests. And any laboratory that's a practitioner of this test species, specifically Cereodaphnia, you as well back in the day, knows at times you get these culture downturns and then it takes a period of time for the culture to recover depending upon the practices in the laboratory and how quickly they address it. And during the period of recovery, the precision is poor. The control variability is higher, the output from the cultures are higher. So I'm sure that'll be some of the details that are discussed in the special study, but that's just some more specificity to what Josh was indicating.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Okay, unless there's other comments or questions on Appendix J, I'm going to move on to Appendix K. So this is just a summary of our lab survey that we did. We contacted 23 laboratories that are accredited by ELAP to conduct the wet testing. So this was not just Cereodaphnia related. And 20 of the 23 laboratories had responded. And our main questions were around some of the concerns that we heard with being able to logistically complete the toxicity tests that would be required to assess compliance with the monthly median effluent limitation within a calendar month. And so the questions we asked were around the logistics of conducting the toxicity tests, what contingency plans do laboratories have in place when tests can't be conducted, and then generally speaking, what are the costs? Do labs charge extra for being ready to conduct a test? Those kinds of things. And if you look at Appendix K, you can see all of the questions and summary responses. Yes, Debbie is, oh, wait.
So if you can go back to the previous slide.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that now we're moving off the subject matter of Cereodaphnia.
Yes.
Because there aren't 23 labs accredited in California for
right.
Cereodaphnia.
That's right.
And then even the number 23, a good portion of those, and I mentioned this at the last workshop, a good portion of those would be analytical laboratories that only provide acute toxicity testing services. So although a little bit of tangent to the main point you're making, there's a smaller pool of laboratories that perform chronic toxicity testing, both municipal and private sector. There are a few out of the state of California that are accredited as well, but logistics of shipping and all that become a problem. And so, yeah, the numbers are right overall, but the reality is the acute toxicity testing, as it was written into the provisions in the past, was going to be up to regional water quality control boards. And so, there's a smaller effect of the acute issue than there is of the chronic issue when you start looking at this number. Fewer chronic toxicity testing laboratories available. And so did that, when you looked at the laboratories that were certified for chronic toxicity testing, did these conclusions change?
No.
Okay.
We got, generally speaking, the summary responses that you see are the summary responses we got from all of the labs. And so if they didn't conduct chronic testing, they weren't going to be able to answer questions about conducting 3 tests within a calendar month. Debbie.
I was on the next slide, but if you still had stuff to talk about it, I'm going to listen first. So.
I haven't even started to talk about this slide. So I'll start now. All right. So this is generally speaking the timeframes that we came up that we've estimated it would take to achieve, should a laboratory have to conduct a third test to determine compliance with the MMEL. So as a quick reminder, you pass your first MMEL routine monitoring test, you don't have a violation, nor do you have to conduct any more tests. So we don't make you go out and do 2 more tests to see if you might have a violation if you do 2 more tests. Just saying. So, second test, so if you fail the first test, then you have to conduct at least 1 more to determine if you have a violation. If that second one fails, then you have a violation and you're done and you know you have a violation and that's that. If you have a pass, a fail and then a pass, then a third test is going to be needed to determine if you're in compliance with the MMEL. So this estimate is assuming that you get to that third test. So the first routine monitoring test is initiated on day 1, whatever that first day of your calendar month is. You can get test results somewhere in the range, and these would be preliminary test results from your laboratory, so this takes some good communication with your laboratory, on somewhere in the range of 7 to 10 days post initiation of the test. Should that be a fail, the second compliance test would be initiated somewhere between day 8 and day 17, with test results being available somewhere between day 15 and day 27, which leaves you just a few days in your calendar month to get that third test in, somewhere between day 16 and initiation on day 28. It could be up to day 31, depending on what calendar month we happen to be in the year, but 28 would be the least amount of time. And then results available sometime between day 23 to day 38, which at that point, you've determined whether you have a violation or not by then. So that's kind of the estimate of timing. Debbie, did you have something you wanted to mention on this slide before?
Just some questions and then some comments. First of all, when you talk about test initiation, is per Appendix K, is that when the laboratory begins its test, or is that when the sample is taken?
That's when the lab begins the test.
So
the
if
sample could
sample's
have
taken the prior month, yes, because if the lab starts on day
I
1,
see what you mean.
the sample would be taken the prior month then? Is that the way that you're starting?
Yeah, technically speaking, it could be 36 hours prior to day 1 initiation of the test.
Okay. And then did you, even between the test, look at the time frame that it then would take if you got that to then set up your sampler and take your 24-hour composite and then transfer it over to the lab? Because it looks like you have 1 day maybe. Did you
Well,
take
we
a
gave
look at that?
ranges, so you get your test results day 7 to 10, and then you know whether or not you need to collect another sample. And so we're estimating anywhere between day 8 and day 17 that next test can be initiated. So if it's within that range, then taking another composite sample seems to be a reasonable thing to be able to do within that time frame. I mean, it's over a week.
So I would, one of the things too, the comments that came up during this, and I would make this a suggestion, and we'll put this in writing, but is to include the testing frequency, and especially for small utilities, to look at really, to have them turn around something in a day, I don't think is realistic. But make sure that you take into account that time frame. And then if they're required to do it over a month, one of the comments that was made is that basically you're testing, if you're taking that second MMEL compliance test, that you're testing the same water. So you're requiring 2 separate tests for testing the same water. And they're going to be evaluating the same water. So I'd ask that you take a look at that too.
When you say they're evaluating the same water, that's because of the overlap when you get to the end of the first calendar month and you start your routine monitoring for the next calendar month.
Yes, and because you have to usually it's going to take 2 sample periods in order to, I'm thinking refresh, what's the proper word? Renewal, thank you. For the renewals, that you're going to be having overlaps going on. So I really would suggest is really laying this out a little bit more than you have here, because I think it's not as logistically simple. And then also to take into account for, look at this also in light of a facility that may not have 24-hour, 7-day-a-week laboratory services.
Any other questions on this or comments? All right. So generally speaking, what we found when we spoke with laboratories was that there should be sufficient time within a calendar month to conduct 3 toxicity tests, and that as long as the initiation of the first test is soon in the beginning of the calendar month. Again, good communication and coordination between the regulated facility and their laboratory is imperative. And certainly, as Debbie mentioned, the size of the laboratory and staff availability can impact the feasibility of conducting the tests in this time frame. So certainly something to be considered. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd probably recommend an adjustment to that last bullet, and it's dependent upon the species. You know, some of the chronic tests, especially the marine ones, are very short in duration. If a compliance test was selenastrum for a client, it's a 96-hour test.
Right.
And so it's where a little bit more of the logistical challenge comes into play is when you're talking to the 6 to 8 day, 7-day tests, and it's less so an issue for the very short duration chronic tests to be able to get 3 tests in a month.
And if I recall correctly, I believe the appendix actually states that as a factor. Which species matters? Yes? Yes. Thank you. Somebody knows it, I know. I read it, I swear. All right. Believe it or not, we are in the home stretch. Yes.
If nobody else is going to comment, I just wanted to share or ask, like, I don't have any problems with what you determined about the lab's capabilities, but the dischargers have expressed concerns about being able to get those samples in order to do those tests. And the assumption is made in Appendix K that the samples are readily available, but that's not always the case. So does the state board have a different response to the dischargers who are concerned about the availability to get samples to?
You mean actually getting out to the facility to collect the effluent sample and getting it to the lab?
Well, no, but in terms of
completing... I think we have heard that comment.
Okay, in terms of completing the 3 tests, if there's a intermittent discharge, or if a sampler goes down, or if there's test failure issues, or if there's...
There are caveats in our provisions that allow for making concessions for uncontrollable issues. There are words in our draft provisions along those lines. I also want to mention that we're looking into somehow helping particularly the remote facilities who don't have Northern California, Central Valley, remote facilities that don't have access to a local lab. So you practitioners, go up there and open a lab, darn it. Come on. Somehow helping to figure out how to coordinate sample collection for those facilities certainly has been a topic of conversation during our staff level discussions based on the comments that we've heard. So I don't know what that would look like, but we're open to assisting as we can.
So I can't address that, but I think one other thing to consider.
You're not going to open a lab.
No, it's just there's just not enough of a volume of work in the remote areas to justify that.
Maybe I don't know. Maybe after these provisions.
But I think one of the other elements that can be done to give some more flexibility is that the EPA method manual has a 36-hour holding time limit, but it can be extended up to, I think it's 72 hours, and it's based upon logistics and things of that sort. And often on the Pacific Rim, when we're doing testing for Guam or other places, you just simply can't get the sample within 36 hours to the States, and so, or to the continental U.S.
Yeah.
And so there could be some flexibility to address maybe some of the discharger challenges of getting samples collected in remote nature and getting to their facility and getting down to a drop at FedEx or whatever because of how remote they are, to extend the holding time to 48 hours or longer. In fact, Swamp for stormwater, I believe, uses a 48-hour holding time limit for many of their studies. So you can cross that bridge by using some of the flexibility in the method manual, but I believe it also says at the discretion of regulatory authorities.
Sure. Okay, that's thank you for pointing that out. Not one that we had considered, so we'll look at that. Yeah, Josie.
I'm just looking at the logistic of getting it done from the operational standpoint of view. But my question is, with the laboratory that you survey, was one of your question possibly include with not only with meeting the conducting the toxicity testing within a calendar month, but realize that when this provision takes into effect, there will be current dischargers that's been doing monitoring frequency on a quarterly basis that will go to monthly. So that, in essence, is also an increased demand on capacity of the labs, and it will impact everything else. From the discharger's point of view, additional costs from increased monitoring and increased replicate, and then at the same time, the commercial lab receiving the sample, influx of samples will be quadrupled, or no, it will increase from 4 to 12. So
Correct me if I'm wrong, but this lab survey didn't include increased capacity associated with more frequent monitoring required in the provisions, although did the cost analysis include that estimate? Did you want to speak to that in any way specifically? So the economic analysis went into some of that information.
Yes, and I used the data that you use. I think City of Davis is one of the example used in the cost analysis. When I go back to check your number, the number you use is low, definitely lower than
lower than what
what it's going to be for us.
Well,
because we're going from quarterly to every month. So the cost estimates is lower than what it was.
Well, the City of Davis, so after we put out the economic analysis and the staff report, City of Davis permit changed, so it became really different. So that was a comment we got, was that this isn't correct, and when we looked at, well, it's correct for the permit that was at the current time when we did it, but it's not correct for the current permit after the permit change.
And we'll be responding to your comment that we've received as well. And just so y'all know, this has been a significant topic of conversation at the October workshop, and we are looking at the required frequencies in the provisions as we speak. So until the board acts, we don't know what the required frequencies are going to be.
I appreciate that. But again, logistically, the impact of changing in the calendar, the reporting or collection for everything else except toxicity, the calendar month definition will be different. The reporting will be different. I will probably, to make sure that we meet, in case we fail the first monitoring sampling, that we will have 2 separate crews collecting for chronic toxicity and separate from other tests. Typically right now, we do the sampling all at the same time for everything that's required for that particular month. So we kind of had to change, possibly even increase our staff to meet increased monitoring and to also meet the calendar month provision. And again, the concern with the civics reporting is another one, but that's a different subject matter altogether.
So I can't help but say that we could always go back to one fail as an MMEL violation. instead of 2 out of 3. We could alleviate all of it by just requiring one test.
But actually, that's not what we're saying. Okay.
No, I
For
understand.
me,
I'm sorry. I just couldn't.
just give
I
me
couldn't
time.
hold it back.
Yes. That's not what we're saying. We just want tools to successfully comply with what you're required, realistically. For us, a calendar month of 28 to 31 days for 3 samples is very, very difficult to achieve.
So I also want to point out that we have done some analysis of who's conducting what type of test, and there's many, many dischargers who do both chronic and acute, and under our provisions, the acute will not be a requirement, and the regional board has discretion to not even do reasonable potential for acute. And so that could be, in many instances, a reduction in the number of tests that a discharger will have to conduct. Not having to do both. So, and I don't off the top of my head know what that universe is, but we've done some looking at that. Tom, you've been wanting to, oh, you're just holding the mic. He's the mic holder.
I don't know how I got that. I just wanted to build on Stephen's point real quick. I think it's an interesting idea, the extension of the holding time. And if you want a reference, you can look as recent as the 2020 MS4 stormwater for LA. I just reviewed it today, and it's a 36-hour recommended and a 72 max. So
yeah,
that's
we will
existed for
definitely
a
look
while.
into that. So thank you. Appreciate that.
So this slide's been up there for a while. So, and I think most people have reviewed it. And I can't recall if this is the exact same timeline as last time that we had the workshop, but it's not too far off from there. And what was discussed going back to the earlier slides in the past meeting was that there would be very likely, wasn't a guarantee, that support from the board and staff supported as well as Siri Daphne, a special study. And there was discussions, I think you projected potentially a 2-year time frame to get it done, maybe as long as 3, need to get an external advisory panel, outside of the state, et cetera. And I think there's general, I wouldn't say consensus, strong agreement in the regulated community of the desire to see a study like that. I think at the scientific conferences, there was a pretty strong consensus among good laboratories that there was a need to resolve the differences between laboratories in terms of performance of that method. So my question here is, for this slide, is there what would prohibit moving forward with starting to plan that?
We are.
And okay,
we're doing
so
it.
That's
We're
that's
writing
new.
contract scope of work right now. We're
Okay.
negotiating. We're trying to get a first meeting going. I don't know. My staff are taking the lead on it, but we are starting the planning.
That's great to hear, because I believe at the last workshop it was potentially pending board approval. There was a desire to move forward, and
No, we're getting started now. Although let me just make sure I'm clear what I mean by scope of work, because when we're talking about the study work plan, that's one of the first things that the stakeholder and science panel is going to develop and agree on. And so we're not developing the work plan scope for the study, but the work plan for a contract that would be necessary to get there. So we're already on our path, and more to come. We'll keep you posted.
tentative timeline, ballparkish for contract approval. I understand, as I recall, it was going to be through SWRCB. And typically in a contract like that, you'd have some projections of expected timelines for completion of external advisory panel and first stakeholder meeting or something like that.
We're guesstimating 2023, December 31st, 2023 will be the date by which we want to basically revert the provisions back to, so we've got all those options, how we're going to deal with what's going on during the study. That has to be written into the provisions. That part will become inoperative at some point, and the date that we're looking at is December of 2023.
And what about a start?
A start, do we have any idea when we're going to have kind of the kickoff meeting?
The state contracting process is always fun.
I think we were looking in
So we're
the
looking
summer.
at the fall. we're ready to move it. The contract would probably be approved and signed somewhere this fall. And then the steps include beginning the formation of a stakeholder panel, stakeholder group, which many of you would have the opportunity to participate in, and then also recruitment of a national expert panel as well.
Thank you.
Welcome. There's a question back here.
Just to go back to the sample hold times and so forth, for the Seriodapnia test with having to take 3 samples for the test, another add-on to that might be able to extend the duration that a sample could be used in the test, because if a renewal could be used up to 96 hours, a sample up to 96 hours, you could collect 2 samples within the week rather than having to do all 3. So if just another added layer of perhaps flexibility in order to get some of those tests underway in the time frame.
So I understood Stephen's comment to be that the method actually provides the flexibility on the hold time. Does it also provide flexibility in that regard?
The method doesn't provide flexibility in that regard, but some permits do, due to intermittent discharge, shipping issues, and things of that sort. Typically in those scenarios, I'm sure most of the laboratories will run into that periodically. There's an engagement with the client. Client engages the water board, informs them of the circumstance, and you may do a test with the first 2 samples because the discharge stopped or the sample got stuck in an airport or whatever it is. So it's not a methodological provision to the best of my recollection. The holding time flexibility is, but it is written into some permits in California.
Thank you.
And just to build on the point again, in stormwater and wet weather, for chronic Seriodapnia, you use 1 sample for the entire time. So it does, again, it's not an EPA method flexibility, but it's one that's in existence right now and being used for monitoring.
Yeah, so just to be clear, most of the implementation provisions in the draft provisions are not applicable to stormwater. I just want to, it's been mentioned a couple times. I just don't want anyone to think that suddenly we're requiring stormwater to do all this stuff.
No, 100% clear it's not, but if you're looking for sort of precedents or grounds to be able to make some of these exceptions, they exist already.
Thank you. I wouldn't be surprised if what did they say about stormwater? They're like multitasking online and they're, what is going on? So just wanted to be clear. Any other questions before I go over the timeline?
John, do we have any questions coming in from online?
No, we don't.
They're all multitasking.
Let her back in and get on.
Back to that schedule slide, slide 20.
The schedule slide? Oh,
or the timing.
Yeah.
If the study to evaluate potential improvements for Serio and the TST result in an increased percentage of brood to maybe 100%, like you mentioned, perhaps one of the Carolinas had, would that affect the time it takes for the lab to provide results?
Yes.
And as such, how might that impact this table?
So from my experience, it could be upwards of 8 days to get to even 60% sometimes. But I would say it would impact the availability of test results by maybe 1 or 2 days, generally speaking. That's just from my own experience. I can't confirm or deny that. But yes, it would impact when the results would be available by a day or so.
And just for my own education, why is the requirement that the test is initiated at the lab during the month and not just the sample taken during the month?
Well, we had to decide. And if it's when the sample's taken, then you shift, it's one way or the other.
Okay.
So, sure, yeah. Give it to Tom.
Until I have a question.
All right. So if there aren't any more questions, I'll quickly go over where we are. I already mentioned that the limited scope public comment period on Appendixes J and K is done on February 10th. Comments are due. We will be releasing sometime subsequent to that both the response to comments on the limited scope, so the 2 appendices, but also the staff report and provisions from October of 2018, because we didn't do a comment period for the July release. And we have yet to make a determination as to whether the changes we've made to the provisions warrant an additional public comment period. So that definitely would impact our schedule if we went out for another public comment period. And so we're not giving a definitive schedule at this stage because of that. So, but I am determined to get this thing over the finish line in 2020. So for whatever that's worth, there you go. And you know who to contact, I think. You guys have all been involved with this for a while. So Zane and Rebecca are primary contacts. Excuse me. And then this is the link for all of the documents that are available. And with that, unless there are other questions or comments, we got a couple.
Just clarification of timeline. As you were presenting today, there were a couple of notation that there will be additional revision that's going to be incorporated but did not make it on the release date as a result of error found or the update on the memo.
Appendices, you mean?
On the appendices. Yes. So you're going to re-release it? Mm-hmm. Do you have a timeline on when? Because
hopefully tomorrow.
Hopefully tomorrow. Okay.
Hopefully tomorrow, maybe even later today. Basically, we need to get it through our web posting colleagues at this point and have it available. We really want it out tomorrow because that leaves a 30-day period of time for you guys all to see it before our February 10th close of public comment period.
But don't stop reviewing the ones that are out there now, because it doesn't make a huge difference. So
it does not.
Don't call me on February 10th. You guys did it. Debbie, sorry.
Yeah, not a problem. So again, on this timeline, and I'm sorry if I missed a specific time frame.
This time?
The timeline, yeah. Is the study timeline. You said you were working on the
scope of work for the contract.
Mm-hmm. So where does that again fit into here, or is there going to be some substantive work? Do you think, or at least a substantive beginning, other than just getting the contract in place before the release? You think it's going to be after? Can you go? Sorry if I
so we're not waiting for the board. We're not going to wait for the study to start or the board. We're not keep tying those things together. We're going to take this to the board, acknowledging that the study is going to be underway, assuming that they want to do that. So they haven't acted on it, but we're proceeding as if that's what they want. And even if it isn't what they want, we can still do a study. That's at any rate. So as you heard from Rebecca, the earliest date for a kickoff is somewhere later this year. If we don't have to go out for public comment, my hope is that there will be an adoption hearing before that.
So an adoption hearing before the study is started. Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to put the two things together as we.
Well, and assuming that the board wants to move forward with a study, the provisions will have a lot of information in there about what happens during the study, and there'll be dates in there, and you'll see a lot of basically what we've talked about in option 4 of how to address the concerns with Cereodaphnia reproduction, if you remember that being developed at our workshop in August.
I did. I'm just trying to reconcile when you say that they're not the same, yet I'm hearing now that there's some dependence of the timeline for the study based upon what option. So that's...
Yeah, the board has to decide what date they're going to put in the provisions by which the study needs to be completed. So that was the December 2023 date that I mentioned. That could be the date. It could be another date. I mean, that's what we're sort of recommending at this point, a 3-year time frame to get the study completed and the results back and recommendations. So yes, there are some dates that need to go into the provisions that are related to the study, but it's not predicated on when the study gets going.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, because maybe I'm not saying it correctly. So with the studying getting going, it will go to the board for approval, just the study alone?
No, the study's not going to the board for approval.
At approval all. It won't be, but it won't be funded until summer, is that, I mean, I'm just trying to figure out.
Funding to get it going, and then
Okay.
you're all going to get a phone call, hey, you.
That's what I'm trying to find out is when is that phone call coming and when are you
Soon.
expecting it?
You should
Okay, thank you.
expect a phone call, and hopefully you're already looking at what kind of in-kind lab services your facilities can provide as part of the study. So, we'll be working on that part of it. But we have funding to get it going.
Okay, so we're looking at that like springish or earlier.
Yeah, you might get a phone call before the end of the month.
Okay. Thank you. That's where I was going.
I'm sorry, I wasn't reading between your lines. Sorry. Any other comments, questions, thoughts? I do want to reiterate the offer that we have made probably at every one of our public workshops is that should you want to meet with us, we're happy to do that. We are meeting with folks as requested. So we're open to those discussions with whomever. It's likely that we will, I'll just say it's certain that once the provisions and staff report go back out, whether or not there's a comment period, there will be a staff workshop to go through what the changes were. So we've got that planned out. So whenever that release happens, you can expect to get to see me yet again. And we'll go over that. And then if there's no comment period, then there's an adoption hearing. If there is a comment period, then you guys can review all the materials yet again and provide us with your comments on the changes. That is, it'll be limited to the changes. But more to come. We'll keep you all posted. Happy reading. Thank you.